Okay, here we go. We're jumping into a new sermon series today. We're going to be in what is my favorite book of the Bible, the book of Exodus, which I love this story. And so I'm going to take you back 3,500 years or so, back into ancient Egypt to the blue waters of the Nile River. See, it's really become the center of the world at the time because everywhere you look in every direction is just hot, dry desert. But this river gives life. And so the world is flocking here. People are flocking here, and it is teeming with energy and excitement. Oh, I love this story. The book of Exodus is so cool that Hollywood has tried to portray it, and books have been written about it. Even kids' movies have tried to portray this story. And yet I will argue that the Bible version is actually the best. It is the most interesting. It is the most engaging and entertaining. This story is awesome. I mean, there's a burning bush, and there's plagues of frogs, and there's an ocean just splitting in half, and there's water coming out of a rock. This book has stories that you can't imagine. Like, you can't make this stuff up. And behind all of it, it's the story of a God who is every day working behind the scenes in the lives of normal people, just like you and like me. And so we're going to spend the next few months kind of going through story by story through the book of Exodus. I don't know, maybe for some of you, you go, I'm not that familiar with the Old Testament, or maybe you kind of feel like, I don't really love the Old Testament. It's weird, and like, seems like God acts different there or something, and give me the Jesus stuff. Like, I totally get that. I hope that you would lean in, and I hope that you would learn to love this book as much as I do, because it is great. And what's really cool, just spoiler alert, the best part is that throughout this story is Jesus. He's all over this thing. And hopefully as we go, I can show you that all of this points forward to Jesus. So today we're going to do kind of a deep dive. I think it might feel a little bit like a history lesson, but if you would, give me a little bit of runway, because I got to get us into this story, into this journey that we'll take off on and go for these next number of months. And what I hope you'll see, starting today, but then over this next season, I really just hope you see the character of God. I hope you see that God is completely committed to a relationship with his people. And God looks at the world, and he sees what we've broken. And he sees and he knows that we can't fix it ourselves, but he can, and he will. And so this story is one of God working behind the scenes to bring about his plan, and it's a good plan. It's for him, and it's for us. So I want to get right into this today. I want to take you to Egypt. You don't have to turn there yet. Just listen, because as we begin the story, what we really get is the voice of a narrator. Exodus opens with the voice of a narrator sort of speaking about the setting and kind of how and when the journey is taking place. It opens this way, the book of Exodus. It simply says, "And these are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. There was Reuben and Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all, and Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, they increased in numbers, and they became so numerous that the land was filled with them." It opens by giving us sort of the setting, the who, what, when, and where, right? But before we go further in the story, we actually have to figure out, how did we get here to this point? Because, interesting, the author of Exodus assumes you know the history. He assumes, he is Moses writing this, he assumes you know the backstory so that when you land in Exodus 1, verse 1, you know everything that has happened up to this point. In fact, the Hebrew Bible, in the original Hebrew Bible, the book of Exodus begins with the word "and." It says, "And these are the names of the people of Israel, Simeon and Levi and Reuben and Judah." And, meaning this isn't a new story. This is the continuation of what's been going on all along. And now this chapter of it, this part of the story begins. And so the writer believes that you know how we got here. Some of us maybe don't know how we got here. And so what we got to do is kind of figure out some of the backstory. So here's what I'm going to do. I want to catch you up. I'm going to take you from page 1. I'm going to go rapid fire. I'm going to take you from page 1 of the Bible to this moment now in about the next 15 minutes. I may or may not take a breath during that entire time because we got to rip through this thing. And it's possible that you don't know a ton of Bible. I'm going to get you up to speed. And maybe you do, and you've heard this all before. That's totally fine. But I just want to go rapid fire through this because we have to know the history. We've got to know the backstory for this book that we're going to spend the next 6 months in. For it to make sense, we've got to know, how did we get here? Because it starts here assuming that we know. So buckle up, here we go. If you have a Bible, you can turn to Genesis 15. I'll get there in a minute. I'll join you there, but first I'm going to go back to page 1. So page 1 of the Bible really gives us a glimpse of how it all starts, right? It is darkness. There is nothing that exists. There is merely a creator. And we hear a voice, and the voice speaks. It's the voice of the one who makes everything. He was not created. He always was. He is the creator. And in the darkness and the quiet, boom, there's a voice who speaks. And when he speaks, everything became. Everything that is became. Mountains, rivers, lakes, valleys, all of it. It happens when he speaks. At the center of all that he creates, he makes a giant rock that is hurtling through outer space at 67,000 miles an hour. It's called the earth. Opposite that, 93 million miles away, he perfectly hangs a star that can heat this earth so that we can live here, so that we can flourish and plants can grow and things like that. He speaks and mountains grow to 30,000 feet and troughs in the ocean go even deeper. And trees grow hundreds of feet tall just at the voice of the one who creates everything. It is on purpose and it is with a purpose that he does this. We turn to page 2 and he creates the masterpiece of all of it. As good as the rivers and lakes and forests and as beautiful as every landscape was, he says, this is my favorite part. This is the culmination of it all. It is people. He makes people in love. He makes people to have a relationship with him, to stay connected to him. He makes people and he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to enjoy life, sons and daughters. I want you to enjoy life. I want you to enjoy a relationship with me. I want you to enjoy a relationship with each other. He tells them to flourish. He says, have families, multiply, he says, and fill the earth and rule over this rock that I've created. It's for you on purpose and with a purpose. Of course, page 3 happens. God is so loving. This creator loves his creation so much that he gives them a choice, because that's what love does. Love doesn't make robots. Love doesn't just sort of play with the joysticks in the sky and move around the characters, but they're really coded to do what they're told to do. In love, he offers his sons and daughters a choice. He hopes that they'll choose love and obedience. But it's their choice. They don't. They choose disobedience. They choose to turn away from God, and they choose sin. And when they do, sin enters the bloodstream for all of time. And with sin comes death. But our loving hero says, it's okay. I'll fix it. You broke it, but I will fix it. I will send someone to make things right. I'll send a champion who will destroy everything that is wrong. He makes this promise that he will set everything right. And so on page 6, he begins that. The one who made it all tears it all down with a giant flood. He says, we're going to rebuild. We're going to start over. And now you can flourish again. But a pattern starts to develop. We mess it up. What God makes beautiful, we ruin. What God is doing and makes wonderful, we tear it down. We destroy it. Never abandoning his plan of love and redemption, he continues to set forth what he said he would do. He introduces us to a guy named Abraham. He's kind of a random guy who just enters the story, this Abraham. He's not a hero. He's kind of a loser, to be honest. God chose a normal, everyday kind of guy to raise up, because if Abraham was a hero, we would be tempted to think that he was the most important part of the story, but he's not. He's just an average guy. God says, Abe, here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave your home. I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave everything you know, and I want you to follow me. He has this way of showing Abraham, like, dude, let's be honest, your life is meaningless. You have no kids, no family, no legacy. It's all over when you die. But he tells him, if you will follow me, if you will trust me and come after me, we can do something beautiful, something really incredible can happen. And we get to Genesis 15, and Abraham is sitting in his tent one day, and God calls him, and he says, hey, Abe, come outside of your tent, and I want you to look up at the sky. I want you to look up at the stars. In fact, I want you to count the stars if you're able, because the number of stars you see are the number of descendants that you will have. I'm gonna make a family tree. I'm gonna make a nation so big you can't count them all. Abraham laughs at him, like, you gotta be kidding me. I don't even have one kid. How am I gonna have an entire nation? Nonetheless, God says, this is what we're gonna do. It's gonna happen. He takes Abraham and leads him to a new land, and he says, this is all gonna be yours. He calls it the promised land. He says, as far as you can see, everything that you can look at, it's going to belong to you and your descendants. He's laying out this promise. He's laying out what we call a covenant. It is an unbreakable promise. It is stamped by the character of God. It is everlasting. It is good. You can hold on to it and trust it. It's this covenant. I'm gonna make you a great nation. Abraham, your family is gonna be as numerous as the stars. But he tells them it's not going to be easy. Listen, there's going to be trouble along the way. And he says in Genesis chapter 15, he gives him a little glimpse of it in verse 13. The Lord says to Abraham, listen, know for sure, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country that's not their own. They will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish that nation, the one they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. He says it's going to be hard. He sets the stage for where we're going in the book of Exodus. Abraham, and this isn't the news that you want to hear. There's going to be suffering. There's going to be challenges. There's going to be burden and hardship. But listen to me, I'm still your God. The promises I have made are good. They're good to your family. They are good to your descendants. And yes, they're going to suffer. But even in their pain and even in their suffering, I will be their God and I will be with them. Slowly, the promise starts to take shape. If you're going to have a large nation, it's got to start with a generation. Abraham at nearly 100 years old and his wife Sarah at 90 years old have a child. How that happens, I'm not sure. Well, I know how it happens, but how it happens, I'm not sure. They have a son they name him Isaac. Isaac grows up. Isaac has his own kids. One of his sons is named Jacob. Jacob grows up. He has 12 sons. I listed them for you at the beginning of Exodus. That's how the book opens. Simeon, Reuben, Levi, Judah, Issachar. These are his sons. One of them is named Joseph. Of all the sons, Joseph is the favorite. Dad treats him different than everybody else. When the sons have to go out and work, the other 11, he gets to stay home and hang out with dad. When they have to toil and sweat and bleed in the fields to get food, to get clothing, he stays at home and dad makes him a special robe, this perfect robe of great textures and colors. Joseph, like most little brothers, doesn't know when to keep his mouth shut. And so one day he has a dream. God shows Joseph that a day is coming when all 11 of your big brothers are going to bow down to you. Joseph thinks it'd be a good idea to tell his brothers this dream that he's had. It's not a good idea because if they didn't hate him before, now they really hate him. Because what is this little punk saying about us bowing down to him? Okay, little brother. So they get this idea and they go, we can't deal with this guy anymore. We're going to kill him because if we don't, he's going to get all dad's inheritance and we're going to get left out. He's the favorite. We hated him before. Now we really can't stand him. So we're going to kill him. They come up with a plan to kill him. Just as they're about to go through with this plan, right there on the horizon, they see a caravan of traders coming, of merchants, and they go, gee, I have an idea. We get rich off this. What if we sell him to that guy? Okay, great, let's do that. That way our conscience is clear somehow and we don't actually have to kill him and we make some money off it. So that's what they do. They sell him. They take that robe, that perfect, precious robe of Joseph's. They kill an animal. They smear blood all over it. They take it home to dad and they go, gee, we don't know what happened. We just found his robe covered in blood. Animal must have got him. Meanwhile, Joseph is traded and he becomes a slave in Egypt. And you got to remember that all of this that is happening is based on that distant promise that great-grandpa got. Remember in Genesis 15, that promise that he would make them a nation, that God would bless them, that they would prosper, that they would be as numerous as the stars, and that they would occupy this unbelievable, lush, rich land. And that promise was stacked on the promise that we learned in Genesis chapter 3, that God would send a hero, that God would send a victor to conquer and to make right everything that is wrong. And so we pick up the story in Egypt where Joseph is been enslaved. It turns out Joseph is a punk, but he's pretty smart. And he rises in the ranks and he becomes sort of an important high-ranking slave. In fact, over a bunch of events, a series of events, and you can read all about it starting yourself at starting in Genesis 37 or so, over the course of about 13 years, he goes from slave to running Pharaoh's house. He becomes his right-hand guy. It's not easy. It's up and down. He goes to prison and all kinds of stuff. He fears for his life, but he shows himself to be trustworthy. And the Bible repeatedly says that God is with him, and he becomes this high-ranking official in Pharaoh's house. In fact, he's responsible for all the food supply for the nation of Egypt, the logistics, the disbursement, all of it. He's the guy. And good thing, because God just gave him another dream. God gave him a hot tip that a famine is coming. It is a worldwide famine. People will be without food, and it will go on for years. So if they will store up food in Egypt, then the world will come to him. They will come to their front door and beg them for food. He goes, that doesn't sound half bad. He tells the plan to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh goes, great, we can get rich. The world can bring their money to us. We will be more powerful. We will be more wealthy. And it's in this scene where we go back to the 11 brothers again. Jacob sends his 11 remaining sons to Egypt to buy food. And when they get there, guess who's in charge of handing out the food? Oh, little brother. Little brother removes the royal robe, unwraps the turban from his head. And you imagine those 11 boys, the faces go white as a sheet. But Joseph forgives them. Joseph is a godly man, and he says, brothers, it's okay. He wraps his arms around them. He says, what you intended for evil, God meant for good. He embraces them. But Joseph has so endeared himself to Pharaoh that Pharaoh also embraces these 11 brothers. Any family of Joseph's is family of mine, he says. And so come to Egypt. Come and settle here. He gives them land. He gives them the opportunity to flourish. He gives them spaces where their animals can graze. When we get near the end of Genesis, and what we start to see is that God's plan is working. Genesis 47 says, now the Israelites settled in Egypt, in the region of Goshen, and they acquired property there, and they were fruitful, and they increased greatly in number. And with that phrase that they were fruitful and increased greatly in number, it's as if Moses is wrapping his arms around the book of Genesis. He's connecting back from one of the last chapters to the beginning, because when God created his masterpiece, his sons and his daughters, what did he tell them to do? He gave them very specific instructions. Multiply, be fruitful, and fill the earth. Subdue it and rule over what I've given you. This phrase that they are now doing connects us back to Genesis chapter 1 and tells us that God's plan is working. It's not the way they would have drawn it up. It's not how we might have imagined it. But God's plan that his children would prosper and be blessed, be fruitful, multiply, and subdue the earth. It's happening. After years of being there and living in peace, they all start to get older. Jacob dies. The sons all start to get old, even Joseph. But before he dies, Genesis closes out with this little cliffhanger in chapter 50. Joseph says to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid, and he will take you up out of this land to the land that he promised on oath. Remember that oath that he made to great-grandpa and to grandpa and to dad? He will make good on that. And we turn the page and we go into the book of Exodus, and it says, and these are the names. So now we have the backstory. Now we have the history of how did we get here, right? God, there's this God who created everything, and he loves his sons and his daughters. They sinned. God is loving. He is also, no doubt, powerful. And so he will fix what has been broken. He will make right what we have wrong, what we have messed up. That plan hasn't changed. And yes, there's going to be hardship, and yes, there's going to be burden and suffering along the way, but he's a good God. And there's also going to be blessing. And there's going to be these little glimpses of his goodness along the way. And if you'll look for them, he says, we'll see them. If we'll open our eyes and our hearts to see God at work behind the scenes and these little doses of his goodness and his blessing, we will see them. I know it's a lot, but we need that history to get us into, to launch us into the story. What I want to do for the rest of our time today is just sort of paint a picture of what the Israelites are going through, because we're going to follow their story over these next number of months. And I want to show you kind of what they are enduring, start to see the struggle they're up against. And I want to start today. I want to start to look for the evidence of God's plan and his goodness and his blessing. Because if you'll look, there's these little glimpses. So we have the scene, they've settled in Egypt. They're in the region of Goshen. They have their own land. They're making babies. They're a growing nation. They're in a foreign place, yes, but they're experiencing the blessing of God. And now the story begins in verse 8. It says, then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Enough generations have gone by that the fact that Joseph was the right-hand guy doesn't matter anymore. This guy doesn't know Joseph, doesn't care who Joseph was. This new king rises to power. He doesn't know Joseph. Verse 9, look, he said, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies. They will fight against us, and they will leave our country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. Just real quick, to show you what's going on here. You remember that God had said they would be enslaved and mistreated, right? I showed you that in Genesis chapter 15. It's coming true. The things that God has said are going to happen are now happening. But Moses is showing something to us here that you might miss. It's easy to miss. He mentions these cities of Pithom and Ramses, these store cities. He refers to them. Something interesting is going on here, and it really speaks to the sort of torturous kind of agony. There's an irony and an agony going on here with the Israelite people. So in the ancient world, the Egyptians believed that their Pharaoh was a god. And so when he ends his life on this earth, he transcends into the afterlife, and he will reign in the afterlife as one of many gods. They also believed that to enter the afterlife and have a successful sort of afterlife, that they had to appease all the other gods. And so they offered sacrifices, food sacrifices to all these other gods to appease them so that when their God goes into eternity, he will have success. I know this sounds a little weird to us, but in antiquity, in a sort of polytheistic, a multi-god culture, this is pretty normal stuff. So they would, even after their Pharaoh dies, they would continue to offer sacrifices to the other gods. And so they would build these warehouses, these barns where they would store all this food that they could use to sacrifice, as crazy as this sounds. And so imagine sort of the irony and the agony that it is the Israelites who have to build these warehouses. The Israelites who worship the one true God, the one God of Israel, they have to build the warehouses to store the sacrifices for these pagan gods, the blasphemous, sort of sacrilegious sacrifices for these gods. Moses is just trying to show us how bad it is. That not only is it hard work, but even spiritually it is crushing, because they are participating in something that they would stand against. And yet, there's a glimpse of God's promise coming true. Because not only are they oppressed in a foreign land like he said they would be, but if we go back to Genesis chapter 12 and part of the covenant that he made, God said to Abraham, you will be a great nation, a nation who is a blessing to other nations. And now what's happening? They are, in the eyes of Egypt, a blessing. They are free labor who is building what Egypt needs. We are seeing God make good on what he has said. And the hope is that we would understand that if we can trust God, that he has done the things he said he would do, that we will continue to be able to trust God to do what he has said he will do. Keep going in the story, verse 12. It says that the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. And so the Egyptians got really mad. They came to dread the Israelites, and they worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. And I think what Moses is doing, there's only one reason that he says that phrase twice, to work them ruthlessly, is he's really trying to make the point that this is brutal, what they are enduring. And yet I feel like he's setting us up a little bit. I feel like he's pushing on us to say, could you slow down for a minute? This is how bad their suffering is. But could you slow down to see that there are also in the middle of it these glimpses of God's goodness? That in the middle of the agony, that it is both physical and spiritual, emotional torture, that there are glimpses of God's goodness and God's blessing. He wants us to look for these little peaks of God's goodness because it's about to get worse. Verse 15, the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. Boys are threats. They can grow up to be warriors, and they can make more sons. And so he's like, we're going to kill all the boys. Girls aren't as much of a threat. They likely aren't going to grow up and lead armies and revolutions. And as twisted as it is, the Pharaoh would have looked at girls and thought, well, one day we can force them to have Egyptian babies and we can continue our bloodline through them. And so we can use them for whatever purposes we want. But the boys, kill the boys. And I think one thing that God is doing, you'll see it play out in the next few weeks. One thing that God is doing, I think, is he's setting up a showdown. A moment is coming where it's God versus God, the one true God of Israel versus the God of Egypt. And we're going to find out who's more powerful. Look at verse 17. The midwives, they were given this order to kill the baby boys. The midwives, however, feared God, and they did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. There's something interesting. There's a bunch of cool stuff happening here. I don't have time to show you everything, but there's something really interesting here. Do you see how we get the names of the midwives? Shiphrah and Puah. We get their names, right? Do you see whose name we do not get? The king of Egypt. So we get the names of these seemingly meaningless slaves, but we don't get the name of the king of Egypt. In fact, we don't, by the way, know which king this was. Historically, we're not really sure. These two women who culturally are insignificant, yet their names are recorded in God's story, in a story that will eventually lead to the Messiah. The king of Egypt, the most powerful man on the planet at the time, we don't even know who he is. Totally lost to history. Completely insignificant, so that we don't even get his name. You see that God is blessing the humble. He's blessing those who fear him and those who are obedient to him. Verse 20, so God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased, and they became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. What Pharaoh had intended to destroy, God uses to build up. Kind of like what Joseph has said, what you meant for evil, God would turn that for good. God used these midwives to build a nation, to restore, not to tear down, but to bring about goodness. And something really cool, we don't know this for sure, but it is likely. In history, they often used women who couldn't have kids to be midwives. And so it's likely that these two women that are mentioned were barren. But God redeems even that story because now they have families, they have kids, they have homes. He's blessing the faithful. He's blessing the obedient. And chapter 1 ends this way. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born must be thrown into the Nile, but let every girl live. And we close out the chapter in this story knowing now that there is no doubt that God is working behind the scenes, not just into the past, not just holding on to that promise that he has made, but now he's working into the future. Because this decree that has just been handed down, this will be mirrored some 1,400 years later when King Herod will issue a similar decree that every Hebrew boy be slaughtered and targeted for execution as a young boy named Jesus. God, of course, will step into that. He will intervene and not let that happen. And you'll see as we continue to make our way through Exodus that honestly all of it points forward to Jesus. And in fact, Jesus, many years later, Jesus is going to say in John chapter 5, hey, you know all that stuff Moses wrote? That was about me. Moses was writing stories about me. And I'll show you more of that, and we'll pick up the rest of the story again next week. But I want to show you, we see these little glimpses of God working behind the scenes here in Exodus. I wonder if just for a few minutes I could kind of push on you to think about the ways that God might be working behind the scenes in your life. Because this is what we do so often. We look around and we go, man, life is hard and the world's a mess and My life is a mess, and I thought I was doing the right things, and I thought I was following God's plan, and yet it's gone in a different direction than I thought it would, and I'm disappointed, or things are moving too slow, or we start to be like the Israelites, and we go, man, how did I end up here? And maybe we even start to wonder if God's still interested, if God is still engaged in our lives. Could you, for a moment, could we slow down long enough to open our eyes and to open our heart, to try and see the ways that God might be working behind the scenes, to see little glimpses in your life of his goodness, of his blessing, amidst what to you often just feels like a mess, right? You think about the Israelites. For them, it was this blessing of growing their family, yes, but also their faith. And really making good on God's promise. Yes, they're slaves in Israel for the moment. But had God not led them here, what would have happened? They were a small clan of about 70 people at the time, with no food, with no real wealth. They would probably be extinct. And so, yeah, it's not the way they would have drawn it up. And yet God's plan was their deliverance. God's plan was actually their survival. It wasn't what they wanted or what they expected, but now they have land. Now they're flourishing. Now their families are growing. Now he's blessing them, and he's teaching them to trust him. So what's he doing in your life? We tend to focus on everything we don't have. We tend to focus on everything that's wrong, how we wish things could be. But slow down for a minute. Slow down and even take inventory. What is God doing in your life? And if your initial reaction is nothing, that's okay. I would tell you to keep looking. Look harder. Look deeper. Look in other areas. What is God doing? Where is he working behind the scenes? And even, again, take inventory, because that allows us to say thank you, right? Could we slow down to say thank you for the little glimpses, the little pictures of hope, the little blessing that God brings about in our lives? God, thank you for my family, right? It's not the family I wanted. It's not the picture of health. It's dysfunctional at best, but thank you. God, thank you for a roof over my head. It's not where I want to live. I want something different in a different place under different circumstances, but I have a place to live. God, thank you for, a friend. God, thank you for Jesus. Thank you for salvation. God, thank you that you forgive me because I'm a liar and I told you I'd never do that thing again, and then I just kept doing it and 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 doing it. So thank you, God. I see you working that out. God, thank you for making some peace in the chaos that is in my mind and heart. God, I know you're working behind the scenes. And whatever it is, just slow down long enough to see it. Maybe thank him. Because these little glimpses of his goodness, these little glimpses, little grasps of his kindness and his blessing are a reminder that he hasn't forgotten, that he hasn't abandoned you. We'll go further in the story next week. I just want you to slow down to see, set the stage for you to see the way God is working behind the scenes, because he worked behind the scenes in this story, and he's working behind the scenes in your life, and you can trust him. I want to read something for you really fast, just from Romans chapter 8. It's quick, and then we'll be done. Romans 8, verse 31 says this. It says, what then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who could be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Father, we are thankful for your word today. Thankful that you are a God who works behind the scenes. God, sometimes we're moving so fast, we don't stop to see it. Would you, right now, for a moment, God, would you show us the ways that you might be working? Could you, Lord, please open our hearts and minds now that we might see little blessing, little goodness that you're bringing about in our life? Because God, you know the ways that we're struggling. You know everything we've brought in our heart and mind with us today. Family's a mess, work's a mess, finances are a mess, our mental health is a mess, our spiritual life is a mess, whatever it is. And we focus on that. Could you help us see a little bit of goodness, a little bit of blessing? Help us be so gracious to us, Father, that you let us get a little glimpse of how you're working behind the scenes. Father, would you keep working? The Israelites in Egypt, they just kept crying out to you, and you heard their prayers, and you were working behind the scenes, and eventually your work came to the foreground. And I think for a lot of us in our lives, God, we're hoping, we're praying that your work becomes really obvious, and you bring resolution to things that are broken. But we'll trust you in the meantime. We'll trust you that you are at work. Thank you that your word points us to Jesus. Please, God, keep calling us back to Jesus, pointing us back to Jesus. And we thank you for him. We thank you that he lost his life so that we could have life. And because of what he did, we know, God, that we can trust you. We know that your word is good and everything you've promised is assured. We trust that you'll keep working for us, God. We love you. We pray these things in Christ's name.